And I'm not able to advance. There we go. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the ISSB itself. An update on the recruiting of the ISSB board members. Excuse me, and then I will go into the exposure drafts, which are open for comment if you don't mind. So just, I think it's helpful to have a little bit of background on the IFRS Foundation itself, which was created in 2001 to develop globally accepted accountancy standards. And those standards, the IFRS accounting standards, are now mandated in over 140 jurisdictions and are allowed in Japan. It has become a de facto global accounting language, if you will, but it wasn't always that way. About 20 years ago, different jurisdictions had different accounting requirements, and we have now kind of coalesced around this common language for accountancy that is used across many, many jurisdictions, as I mentioned. There are 3 tiers of the governance of the IFRS. The trustees are responsible for strategy and oversight of the standard setting boards. They are in turn accountable to a monitoring board of capital market authorities responsible for corporate reporting in their own jurisdictions. The monitoring board provides public accountability for the IFRS. And the oversight structure was established, and the standard setting process means that the IFRS Foundation is in a very good place to build investor-focused sustainability disclosures, which was undertaken in the context of this current sustainability reporting landscape, which, in which we find multiple voluntary initiatives, incomplete application of those initiatives, multiple audiences targeted with a variety of different tools, and then jurisdictions around the world beginning to kind of catch up with the voluntary reporting. Different jurisdictions have different requirements. There are differences in the scope and the ambitions that are in place. And as a result, what we find is the consequences of all of those different standards has meant costly and complex reporting that is difficult to benchmark, very limited transparency, limited global consistency and comparability of data, and really, at the end of the day, diminished confidence and trust in the information. So it was against that backdrop that the IFRS trustees began to inquire with the market whether or not they should establish an International Sustainability Standards Board to be a sister board of the IASB. And in November of 2021 at COP26, the IFRS trustees, in response to market feedback, announced that they would in fact establish the ISSB. They also announced in November of last year plans to consolidate the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, or CDSB, and the Value Reporting Foundation, which itself was the result of the merger of the International Integrated Reporting Council and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board last June. Those 2 entities would be consolidated up into the IFRS. We'll talk a little bit more about where we are with that in a moment. And at the same time in November, published prototype general reporting requirements and a climate standard that was the work of a technical readiness working group that had many, many players around the table, many, many existing standard setters and framework providers coalescing around the table to say, all right, if and when the ISSB were to begin setting standards, what could it look like if they built upon the work of those other organizations? So what will the ISSB actually do? The ISSB's remit is to develop a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards and a taxonomy to facilitate digital reporting. The focus is on meeting investor and other capital market participants' information needs. The standards will enable companies to provide comprehensive information about sustainability matters to financial markets. And you'll hear us talk a lot about 2 things related to the ISSB: formation of a foundational global baseline for sustainability-related disclosure, as well as a building blocks approach to the creation of a comprehensive global system for corporate reporting. ISSB standards will establish that global baseline of disclosure to meet the needs of investors with global portfolios. And ISSB standards, will be developed to facilitate comparability with the requirements that are jurisdiction specific. So that's when we talk about a building block approach, using the global foundational baseline at its base, that jurisdictions can, if needed, add to or augment to begin providing investors with this foundational set of data that is comparable and consistent across markets, yet meeting the different and varying levels of ambition, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So let's talk about where we are with the establishment of the ISSB itself. So the three initial appointments were Emmanuel Faber as chair of the ISSB, Sue Lloyd, vice chair, and Janine Gilead, who is the current CEO of the Value Reporting Foundation, as a special advisor to the chair of the ISSB. Ultimately, the ISSB will have 14 board members, the majority of whom will be full-time, with diverse expertise and experience and a good geographical balance. And we've seen recently, just last week, the announcement of 4 additional appointees to the ISSB. Richard Barker is currently Deputy Dean and Professor of Accounting at Said Business School, University of Oxford in the UK. In that capacity, he leads Oxford Said's sustainable business initiatives and has published a wide range of academic research papers on accounting and sustainability disclosures. He chairs the expert panel of Accounting for Sustainability, or APAC, as it's commonly known, and has previously served as a member of several committees and bodies focused on corporate reporting in the UK and Europe, including the UK Corporate Reporting Council, the Financial Reporting Advisory Board, and the European Accounting Association's Accounting Standards Committee. Professor Barker has also served as a research fellow at the International Accounting Standards Board. Verity Chager brings a wealth of investment and standard setting expertise to the ISSB. She has 20 years of experience in sustainable investment and stewardship, portfolio management, and investment research with both asset owner and asset manager perspectives. She joins from the California State Teachers Retirement System, commonly known as CalSTRS, where she leads the pension fund's policy engagement on sustainable investment and stewardship issues and manages the fund's work to reach its net zero ambition. She was previously with BlackRock, where she integrated sustainability considerations into the investment process, portfolio company engagement, and proxy voting. And she's also currently serving as co-vice chair of the SASB Standards Board, where she's been overseeing the development and maintenance of SASB's industry-based standards since 2017. Bing Lung is currently a director of the Accounting Regulatory Department of the Chinese Ministry of Finance, where he oversees the sustainability reporting initiatives of the Ministry of Finance. He initiated and led the implementation of several reporting-related programs, including the development of digital taxonomies to enable electronic reporting and plans focused on, digitizing the accounting profession. He serves as a member of the International Accounting Standards Board's IFRS Taxonomy Consultative Group and has also served as a member of the Board of Directors of XBRL International. He's a Doctor of Management and has a Master of Accounting from Tianjin University of Finance and Economics. And last but certainly not least is Ndidi Nyoli Edozian. Her career has been focused on building connections between business and sustainable development, working across multinational and indigenous companies, public institutions, and civil society organizations in Africa and Europe to initiate sustainable development initiatives. In her last role, she served as the inaugural Group Chief Sustainability and Governance Officer of Dangote Industries Limited, one of Africa's largest manufacturing businesses. In that role, she was responsible for the development of the company's sustainability culture, strategy, and reporting across 14 countries. Dr. Noli Ndozian has founded and served on several boards, committees, and initiatives focused on corporate culture, impact investing, sustainability reporting, and governance. So I would say that the ISSB is off to a roaring good start, and we can expect further announcements of future of board members who will be announced in the coming weeks. So when I talk about a building block approach, I hope that this mental model comes to mind. This is something that we've developed over time. That was first published, or a form of this diagram was published back in 2020, in September of 2020, through the work of the IMP before SASB and IRC even merged. And it really is meant to lay out the components of that very busy disclosure and reporting landscape that I refer to in some of my earlier slides, but really with with the idea of noting how these puzzle pieces really fit together. So back in those days, which seems like ancient history, there was sort of this idea that one standard could be possible to meet the needs of all stakeholders across all jurisdictions. And when we really sat around a table with one another, we discovered that, well, actually, there are different tools that are designed for different audiences. And we have in the innermost box here, financial reporting, investor-focused reporting that is promulgated through the International Accounting Standards Board. In the US, through the FASB. In Japan, there are a number of accounting standards that are in play. But for the most part, companies know that investors expect their financial reporting to be done based on agreed upon accounting standards or principles. So that's the innermost box. And in the next box, the red box you see, this is where we're talking about this foundational global baseline for sustainability disclosure, sustainability related financial disclosures with an investor audience in mind. Reporting on those sustainability matters that may reasonably create or erode enterprise value over the short, medium, and long term is how we're looking at that foundational global baseline. And then you can think of the outer box as one that is sustainability reporting that's focused on meeting the needs of a much broader audience of stakeholders, a multi-stakeholder focus, focused on impact. What are the impacts that a company is having on the economy, on society, on the environment? You can see that there are perforated lines between the chambers of the different parts of this ecosystem. And that's really to designate that there is no bright line, there's no concrete barrier between one or the other. We've seen, for example, with the global pandemic of COVID, that things that were almost unimaginable that could have inhabited this outer box here quickly pressed through the membrane of financial materiality, if you will, and have impacted literally every industry around the world, and that took many people by surprise. So the idea here is that we lay out these puzzle pieces and then begin to set standards that over time become interoperable so that we have the same language to talk about these different issues that may not yet be demonstrating to affect enterprise value today, but soon could be. So this is the vision that we have in mind, that we begin with this global baseline, and that jurisdiction by jurisdiction, if it's necessary, jurisdictions can add on to that as necessary. I think one of the key takeaways here with the establishment of the ISSB, and particularly as it's related to the exposure drafts, which we'll talk more about in just a moment, is that the disclosure landscape is being simplified in a very dramatic way, although it may not be obvious at first. So there are 3 or 4 things that are really consolidating down into fewer moving parts. TCFD recommendations, SASB standards, and the integrated reporting framework are those that are demonstrated here on this slide. The CDSB framework is also part of this consolidation. So what do I mean by that? TCFD recommendations and SASB standards are both in the process of going through an ISSB due process and are part of the ISSB disclosure standards. They are key components of those exposure drafts. SASB standards are also going through an ISSB due process vis-a-vis the industry-based disclosure requirements that are priority materials in the general reporting requirements, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And then the integrated reporting framework is going through not only an ISSB due process, but also an IASB due process, because the integrated reporting framework will be vetted through those different standards boards to contribute to the work aimed at demonstrating the connectivity between financial and sustainability disclosure. And that's a commitment from the IFRS trustees that they don't want this information to be siloed, that they will build this connective tissue so that the integrated reporting framework is going through a very important process as well. I should also note that with the consolidation of the Value Reporting Foundation and all of our resources into the IFRS at the end of June this year, the IFRS will take responsibility for the evolution and advancement of SASB standards, of the IR framework over time. So both of those things will live on for a short while, and it will become part of the ISSB standard setting process and the IFRS, IASB, and ISSB vetting process for the IR framework. So now let's talk about the exposure drafts. We have IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. In plain English, IFRS S1 are general reporting requirements, and IFRS S2 are the climate disclosure standards. And so let's talk first about the general requirements. This requires companies to provide material information on all significant sustainability-related risks and opportunities that are necessary to assess enterprise value. This is the equivalent of IFRS accounting standards IAS 1 and IAS 8. And as I mentioned, SASB standards serve as priority materials for complying with the proposed standard. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a few slides. One of the key things that I think it's really important to recognize about something that I think is remarkable, among many things about the general reporting requirements, is that it takes the architecture of the TCFD recommendations and puts them into the architecture of general reporting requirements. So it provides a very helpful framework for management and for investors to understand a company's governance, strategy, risk management, targets, and metrics about common sustainability issues that affect or could affect the enterprise value of a company. There are, in the general requirement standards, both thematic or cross-cutting, cross-industry requirements, as well as industry-based requirements. So those are the core elements of the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. One of the things that I think it's really helpful to bear in mind is, why are TCFD and SASB such key elements of this general reporting requirement? And what we see here on this slide is something that Goldman Sachs produced earlier this year, which is an analysis of what GRI, TCFD, and SASB reporting looks like, beginning with 2015, when you see TCFD is just a tiny little sliver in red. I'm sorry, SASB is just a tiny little sliver in red here, and TCFD is barely visible in light blue, versus GRI reporting, which has been around for decades, and again, it serves a very valuable purpose in meeting multi-stakeholder needs. You can see that from 2015 to early in 2022, I don't have an updated slide. I think this is probably around February of 2022. We see that SASB disclosure, TCFD disclosure is really neck and neck with GRI disclosure among the S&P Global 1200 companies. Those are large cap companies in major markets around the world, but those two, that standard and framework combination of TCFD and SASB have really come in to fill the gaps of investors' information needs. And so I think it's tremendous that the IFRS, the ISSB listened to the market. They listened to the feedback that they got, saying, if you do set up ISSB, please build upon the existing work of entities that are around who are already trying to address investor needs. So how to report on all risks and opportunities. The general reporting exposure draft sets out how you would require companies to report on all significant sustainability risks and opportunities. So for climate-related risks, a company would use the ISSB climate proposals, IFRS S2, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But if the ISSB hasn't set out specific requirements for a sustainability matter, then the general requirement standard says to consider SASB industry-based standards and the materials from the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, both to identify the topics that investors may be interested in, but also the disclosures that should be provided to them. So in the absence of an IFRS sustainability disclosure standard for a particular industry, they point to SASB's industry-based standards as a starting place for companies to consider what it would be relevant for them to disclose subject to a materiality assessment. So moving on to the climate exposure draft, this requires the disclosure of material information about significant climate-related risks and opportunities. As I mentioned, it incorporates TCFD recommendations. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. It includes SASB's climate-related industry-based requirements as part of the standard. So in this case, SASB's 68 industry standards, which are relative to climate, are part of this actual exposure draft. They are not priority materials. They are part of the standard and are thus going through an ISSB due process. This requires disclosure of information about physical risks, transition risks, and climate-related opportunities to sort of offset the risks that companies are expected to report on. Now, when I say it incorporates TCFD and SASB, there are some significant kind of upgrades that are included in the climate disclosure standard or exposure draft. And the augmentation of the TCFD recommendations are really designed to improve the assurability and auditability of that kind of reporting. And in building on SASB standards, you'll notice some key improvements to the SASB standards that are included in Appendix B. One, there has been an effort to make more internationally applicable some problematic metrics, which we are aware of. So some of those in the climate standard have already been improved and made internationally applicable in other markets. And then there's also the inclusion of financed and facilitated emissions, which was not originally included in standards for the financial sector, for example. When the standards for the financial sector were issued early on, probably even in 2013, 2014, the provisional standards were made. PCAF did not exist, and a common way of calculating financed or facilitated emissions was an emerging idea. Fast forward to 2022, the market has kind of coalesced around certain a protocol for calculating these emissions. So that is an upgrade, if you will, or in addition to the SASB standards that are appended to the climate disclosure standard. So after issuing these exposure drafts at the end of March, we have embarked upon significant market outreach. Here's just a high-level overview of what we've been doing, focused in 3 core areas of education, sort of aiming at driving engagement and receiving technical input. And the formats of this outreach range from the webinars like the ones that we're doing today, panel discussions, large group meetings, and targeted smaller meetings. And we encourage you to provide us with feedback. It's exciting to hear that you're going to be submitting a comment. We encourage that. How do you comment on the proposals? There is either an online survey that you can fill out, or we welcome comment letters. And it's not necessary to answer every question in the consultation. If you do write a separate comment letter, those comments are all due by the 29th of July. And there's a URL here that you can follow to get to the survey and find out more about submitting comments. We're also encouraging calls to action by encouraging people to participate in and respond to other public consultations in relevant jurisdictions, because the idea here is for this to be a global baseline. And in order for that to happen, different jurisdictions around the world need to hear what investors in particular, as well as other stakeholders, are seeking when it comes to the establishment of a global baseline. So the SEC's climate change disclosure public comment consultation closed just last Friday. We're beginning to analyze letters that the SEC has received on that. And then the FRAG ESRS exposures drafts are open for public consultation, and that is open until the 8th of August, and the URL to find those are here. So we build on technical work previously developed by the market and architecture widely used by companies. We aim to ensure that the standards are internationally applicable and really are aiming to establish this global baseline approach, which is strongly supported by international organizations, most notably the G7 and IOSCO. So please, please, please comment to other jurisdictions that have things open for comment, encouraging them to sort of rally around the establishment of this global baseline and harmonize standards that may be forthcoming in other jurisdictions. Other things that you can expect from the ISSB later this year will be a request for information to solicit stakeholder feedback on what strategic direction and balance of ISSB activities should be forthcoming. What is the suitability of proposed criteria for assessing the priority of sustainability related matters that should be added to the ISSB's work plan? as well as a proposed list of sustainability-related matters that could be added to the ISSB work plan. So this request for information will present the ISSB's preliminary view on potential near-term priorities, bearing in mind the projects to which it's already committed, which include the exposure drafts, which are currently out for comment, the development of this digital taxonomy, as well as putting SASB standards through their due process. So there are many, many ways of staying informed about what's happening with the IFRS. As I mentioned, the Value Reporting Foundation consolidates into the IFRS at the end of June. All of our staff become IFRS employees beginning July 1st. So you can reach us through our old emails for a while. They'll all get forwarded to the IFRS. There are many ways shown here about how to stay engaged. I'm happy to talk more about the future of integrated reporting, as well as the future of SASB standards, but I'm also aware of time. So I'll pause here for questions, and let me know if if you want me to go back to any of that about the IFRS, or sorry, the IR framework and the SASB standards.
Thank you very much, Katie. You skipped several slides that you sent us, and also that we providing through this chat box. And I also downloaded it.
I'm so sorry.
No. You don't need to rush because today we have 1 hour and a half.
Okay.
So maybe later you can, if you need, you can, if you can introduce us some slides that you skipped. Now,
if you want to share your slides, and I'm sorry about that, we have because of the addition of ISSB board members. I think that may have bumped some other slides out of the deck. I apologize for that.
No, that was has 37 pages if you download from this chat box, and then that this is also included about the IO score or something like this. But it's okay.
Okay.
So
yes.
Today some people starting to send us the question, but before that, maybe today is today's purpose of this webinar is answering the responding to this consultation. So the first, I would like to ask several questions to Katie, and we also sent the post the questionnaire link. So I'm going to share this one. Moment, which one? Oh, sorry, there are a lot of pages now, and yes, maybe this one. Can you see the survey? So if you click to the link of the survey from the chat box, now we post it on the chat box, you can access to this the survey. And then as Katie said, currently for responding for the consultation, ISSB also prepared the survey. But this survey is so that you don't need to write all the response, the comment letter for ISSB. So just answering to the survey, and you can send your opinion to the ISSB. However, this original survey is for anybody. I mean, so not only investors, and also that the question is covering all of this exposure draft. So the CFA Japan prepared some question that is maybe more related to the investors. So that you can also go to directly go to the ISSB homepages and then answering this survey, and also that you can answering this questionnaire provided by CFA Society Japan, and after collecting these answers, we will gathering these answers and then send to the ISSB as comment letter styles. So there are several questions here, and so the following these questions, I would like to a couple questions to Katie's. So the first question is this: the disclosure standard is so-called materiality. It is important. So materiality based. So the companies which is disclosing using this standard is disclosing. This standard require company to disclose material information of this company's business. Can I ask you to a little bit more explain about this part?
About the materiality?
Yeah. So this standard is require company to how company should disclose about this company's materiality of the business or something.
So you're absolutely right. The IFRS is leaving this up to companies to do their own materiality assessment. And when I say it, for example, in the general reporting requirement, they point to priority materials, the SASB standards. If you're in this industry or these industries, you know the businesses that you operate in. If you're a conglomerate, look at the standards in those industries and see if those are the topics you think your investors would want to know more about vis-a-vis the sustainability matters that are likely to affect enterprise value. So it's all of these requirements are subject to a materiality assessment. Now, that materiality assessment is what would your investors likely want to know about. So, it's not a blank check, if you will, for companies to say, oh, that's not material to us. I mean, you really do need to have a conversation with management, with your investors. So again, the IFRS Foundation's focus is on meeting the information needs of investors. So that's always the lens through which you should be thinking about these materiality assessments.
Yeah, that is same as IFRS. IFRS also have a practice statement materiality judgment, and it also requires a company to disclose something that the investor need for the investment judgment. So this IFRS sustainability standard also same as a company require a company to disclose something material information which is investor needed.
That's exactly right.
So this materiality is somehow today's attendee also might have heard about this the double materiality by EUs. So, but this IFRS is single materiality. Always important is what investor needed, is my understanding.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting conversation because I think that the human mind gravitates towards simple distinctions between things that are sometimes much more complex. So it's also, I think, helpful for us to think about where the elements of the components of these exposure drafts came from, and the standard setting process that SASB followed, so the SASB standards are part of these exposure drafts, really sought market feedback and it began by looking at and scanning the reporting environment at the time, 10 years ago. What were companies reporting on a voluntary basis about their impacts? So reporting at that time was all about impacts for the most part. And most of it was based on GRI. So we had that universe to scan from. So then our standard setting process took a look at all of that and said, all right, we'll put an industry lens over that, and then start to identify, our analysts started to identify what are those impact related things that can also come back and affect the financial condition, the operating performance, the market valuation of a company, of an average company, a typical company in that industry. So if you think about it that way, the SASB standards and now the ISSB standards really represent a subset of things that are double materiality, but they're not counting. And this is where the distinction is very important. The standards, SASB standards and ISSB standards, don't quantify the impact in many cases. GRI standards do that. So that's the impact focused kind of measurement, if you will. What you'll find in the metrics of the ISSB standards and SASB standards is the measurement of performance on things that affect the enterprise value of the company. So it's a tricky and a very complicated relationship that for the human mind, we want it to be this or that. And in this case, it's really a both and in some cases. But again, squarely focused on, at the end of the day, what is the potential impact on enterprise value? So, but it's not unrelated to impact. So it's not a bright line distinction.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So the next question is basically this questionnaire from the CFA Society Japan is basically based on several questions that was original survey from the ISSB. So the original questions, original survey questions is also asking us about this exposure draft is explanation of the requirement of this exposure draft is good for investors or enough for investors, asking again and again. This part is the governance. So if you click this part, this one, I highlighted some pages from because the original exposure draft have huge pages, so that highlighted the related part, and you can read this from the what's the exposure draft requiring about the disclosure of governance. And then this governance is, if you can ask you, Katie, if you can explain a little bit about what is required for the company to disclose about these governance pages. It's something very important part that you want to highlight it.
It's very hard for me to read the text. It was very tiny on my end, and I'm trying to figure out how to make it larger, but I don't think I can.
Yeah, but I think this one is also say that about this require about to explain company to some what kind of the structure of the company's governance structure of the company. For example, board or committee or some equivalent body charged with governance. So that also this so it looks like only climate change. Some people are asking to us this ISSB first consultation is only about climate change, but this one is especially about S1 is require company to disclose some minimum requirement about governance structures.
Right. And it's the governance of the sustainability matters that are likely to affect enterprise value. So in this case, it's not limited to climate. And I think maybe people are relating this to climate because it's drawn directly from TCFD recommendations, this architecture, this governance strategy, risk management targets and metrics. So that is also the architecture of the general reporting requirements, which I think is the basis of this question. Asking a company to think about who on your board is responsible for the governance of the oversight of the management of these issues. So I think it's getting to that question really.
But it's not looks like so that we have been discussing so much about the governance issues. So that for example, corporate governance code require a lot of the contents, require company to disclose a lot of contents. But the comparing with the corporate governance code, it looks like not so many detailed contents. So, but it's maybe it also require about the same level of the TCFD require about governance disclosure.
It's drawn directly from the TCFD, but as I mentioned, with some augmenting to make it more assurable and accountable, or sorry, auditable.
Yeah. So you can access from this link when you're the answering this question layer. And also the next question is about the business model and the strategies. And the business model and the strategy is this exposure draft mentioning more about the governance. And it looks like many contents about the sustainability-related risk and opportunity required to disclose sustainability-related risk and opportunity and the strategy and also the decision-making process, resilience, and financial position. Important point is financial position, financial performance, and cash flows. So if you have any additional explanation about this part, the exposure draft, how exposure draft is emphasizing the encourage company to disclose about this the business models.
Again, it's taking the TCFD architecture and embedding it as the architecture for broader sustainability reporting for a company to explain the significant sustainability related risks and opportunities that would be material to its investors. So what is your strategy for if you are a beverage company, for example, in a water stressed area? What does your business model look like over time? So it's really, I think, helpful to framing the conversation around sustainability disclosure around those things that intersect with a company's core business risks, as well as some opportunities, and asking there to be this common architecture for the way companies report that information out to their investors. So finding the same kind of structure of reports, so an investor would know, and know what to expect, that it would be in this format, talking about what is your governance, what is your strategy, what is your risk management look like around general sustainability risks, not only your climate related risks.
Yes. Thank you. And also that this exposure draft asking to the asking us about is this exposure draft is enough for about the requirement to disclosure about risk. So I also prepared the link of the risk. Is this requirement of this is business model, so risk. And so you can click here, and then risk is relatively not so many explanations, but I think that if you find anything about more additional requirement, please write here this box so that I can gather all the answers and then send to the to ISSB as comment letters.
And then I would just encourage everyone, if you're interested, there's also a Japanese version of these exposure drafts. So that's also available if you would rather not.
Yes. And also I put this link of the original exposure draft, and then that there's a S1 and S2. So you can click here. So you can jump into this the all other translation versions. So that you can download the Japanese version, and also we are so happy if you write this questionnaire in Japanese too. And also the another question is, so this is very important questions, these ones. This consultation, exposure draft, proposed us to the boundary of the sustainability report is same as a financial statement. So that the questionnaire from original questionnaire also asking us the boundary of reporting. What is good for the boundary of reporting? So, Katie, do you have any additional opinion about this part? Additional comment, explanation about this part?
The intention here is to elevate the quality and the comparability, the meaningfulness of sustainability disclosure to investors to the same level of quality as they have in their general purpose financial reporting. So making the boundaries the same, encouraging companies to report at the same time that they report their financial statements is all designed to, the intention is to sort of help the evolution or the maturation of the sustainability disclosure, so it is investment quality. So the boundary question, the timing question are all aimed at getting that information on the same footing.
So some typical question about this part is I have heard, for example, that the financial statement is okay on a consolidated level, but in case of the sustainability information, somehow investor need to do some the supply chain information, or somehow, so the boundary might be more larger or not. So there are such kind of discussion has already I have had. So if you have any additional opinion, if you have any comment or opinion, please write on this box about these boundary issues. And if you, Katie, do you have any more comment?
I think that's an interesting point about the supply chain example as a great example. So if you would, rather have it disaggregated or have, there be, a different treatment of this reporting, this now is the time to provide feedback so that it can be reflected in the deliberations of the full standards board or a quorum of the standards board after the comment period is closed. So we really welcome your thoughts on, what best meets investor needs.
Yes, thank you. And next is connectivity. As Katie explained a little bit about the page, I think slide 13, the sustainability information is also emphasized about the connectivity in this exposure draft. So there are several types of the connectivity. So what the kind of connectivity is more this ISSB is now considering about it? Katie, if you have any additional explanation about this part, for example, connectivity with financial statement or connectivity with other, for example, TCFD report or some other the information outside of the reporting, or how about?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting area. So ISSB intentionally did not say you must disclose here in your, when it comes to these sustainability related pieces of information. companies may choose to put it where they think it is most relevant for their investors, but IFRS definitely wants to begin to demonstrate the connectivity between those two streams of reporting. And at some future state, perhaps they'll converge. I think that's the idea of using elements of the IR framework, for example, to begin creating connectivity between the two, what you find in mainstream or general purpose financial reporting versus sustainability reporting. So what we're seeking right now is feedback from the market about what is most meaningful to you when it comes to that connectivity. So we value your thoughts and feedback on that.
Yes. And the next one is this is also coming from original questions. And is this sustainability information should be written on the same report, physically same report of the financial statement? This is a very simple question, but Katie, if you have any additional explanation about this part.
It's really seeking market feedback on how, we jokingly used to say back in the early days of SASB, investors didn't care where you put it, they just wanted the information. We're now seeking from the market, do you still feel that way, or would you prefer to have it in the financial report? That comes with implications, right? So that comes with costs. It comes with a host of challenges. Is that possible for small and mid-cap companies to even achieve? So all of those things need to be considered when you're thinking about these questions. But we're basically asking the market, do you have a preference? And I can't really add more to it than that.
Yes, thank you very much. And my last question. And you said that also about the global-based standards, and also that the ISSB have been discussing about the building block approach. So unfortunately, as Katie said, now is EU is developing their own sustainability standard, and also that the US SEC also trying to develop their own climate change disclosure. How ISSB trying to design to connecting with the so-called building block with other regional the disclosure requirement? What kind of pattern will be possible? If you have any additional explanation about this part.
Yeah, there is a lot of work underway, and I probably don't have the right numbers, but if I had to put a percentage of activity related to that, talking to a variety of jurisdictions and trying to get people into the same tent, I would say it's 70 to 80% of the time of key staff at ISSB has been dedicated to rallying around the concept of this global baseline. Among the things that I can point to, which is kind of a concrete example of the efforts that are underway, was the recent establishment of the Sustainability Standards Advisory Forum, which is a forum for jurisdictions to join and have these conversations around a table about, okay, how do we coalesce around this global baseline with varying levels of ambition and being at different places on the arrow of time when it comes to how advanced some markets are compared with others in what they've done or are thinking about doing. So the first meeting of and I think they call it SAF for short, the Sustainability Standards Advisory Forum, included the CSRC from China, the US SEC was in the room, I believe EFRAG was in the room. So we have regular conversations around this, coalescing around, let's get the baseline set, so something that we can all sort of agree upon the foundation of, and then, how do we then encourage the jurisdictional adaptation if it's necessary. So I think it's really encouraging to see. One, we also see IOSCO, which is the governing body of the IFRS trustees, IOSCO very much leaning in on, it would be very advantageous to have this global baseline. They are reviewing with an eye towards potentially endorsing the adoption of the ISSB standards in the jurisdictions of members of IOSCO. So there's a sort of strong direction of travel, but we have a lot of work to do, right? Because FRAG's efforts began well before the ISSB was established. So there's a little bit of a timing dysfunction. Now is the time to provide feedback to FRAG, for example, to say, hey, double materiality, we completely understand that approach to what's being mandated in Europe, but build that on the foundational global baseline of the enterprise value side of double materiality is what ISSB is focused on. So let's coalesce around that. So, lots of conversations underway, and it's now is the key moment in time to provide that feedback to the market if you can.
Yeah, I think that if each, at least the three regions, EU and the US and ISSB, are developing a slightly different type of the disclosure, is a very much essential part. It's become coming like a chaos on the company side and the investor side, because many companies listing on the US and also that the EU are treating something about the the business in EU, so that the company needed to prepare 3 patterns, and also the investor needed to
which is not good for anyone, right? That's not helpful, because then investors think about that. So companies have the burden of reporting to 3 different sets of standards. And then investors have to assess and evaluate and try to compare those things. If they're not built on the same foundational building block, that becomes costly for everyone. It's really, I think, helpful. And it's really too soon to say, what responses to question 189 of the SEC's climate consultation will be. But that was a very interesting open door, asking whether or not, if the SEC climate rule is implemented, whether the SEC should allow the use of ISSB standards to comply with the climate rule. That would be a huge win. And it would also be a huge win if FRAG would say, you know what, you're right, we'll build our impact measurement side of double materiality. We'll build that on top of the foundational global baseline focused on enterprise value. But we're still in the midst of those conversations. So now is definitely the time to comment, because I think everyone agrees, and FRAG is beginning to hear this from the market. They're hearing letters from major corporates in both France and Germany that, hey, double materiality is fine, but please build it on the ISSB's work, which wasn't here when you started this process, but now it is. And it would be advantageous for all of us if we could coalesce around that and then, expand on it as is needed in the European Union. So it is a really unique moment in time to sort of say, and encourage the harmonization, right?
Yes. So that we are going to send a comment letter to ISSB. So please respond to this survey and after this webinar. So now let's go to the question from the audience. So Katie, can you open the Q&A box?
Yes.
So the first question from the coming in. So what do you think about? So very small letter. What do you think about if you would define the word sustainability in the Appendix A? If can you read this?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you think about if you would define? So are they asking for us to define the word sustainability in Appendix A?
So I think that the attendees wanted to ask you about this. What is the definition of sustainability? So the Appendix A of the Appendix A is about the exposure draft, and I think it was definitions about. So if you remember.
Okay, sorry, it's very late here. So let me pull that open so that I can better answer your question.
So that if in this that area, if you mean ISSB can define what is sustainability. So I think it's I have heard a similar question from the some investors. Is the EU trying to define what is ESG using a taxonomy?
Right.
So that was also become a long discussion. So what is sustainability? What we should do if we want to be is a sustainability company or sustainability investment? What do you think?
Well, obviously, we all need to agree on what we're, what the aim of the disclosure is, right? So disclosure doesn't solve all problems, but it's very helpful to begin assessing how people are managing key risks and opportunities. So what I think I'm hearing, and I'm just confirming this now, is that there is the definition of sustainability related financial disclosures in Appendix A and sustainability related financial information. But it sounds like Hirata-san is asking, or we're thinking that there ought to be a definition of sustainability itself.
Maybe it looks like
right?
a taxonomy, 500 pages.
Yeah.
What is, if you say that this is green, you have to, the emission level is under the
right. Yeah. So I think it's worth making the comment that there ought to be the addition of a definition of sustainability in Appendix A, because we have other defined terms like sustainability related financial information and sustainability related financial disclosures. So I think it's a good point that I would encourage you to make in your comments, that we would feel better knowing that we're all talking about the same term here. So I think it's a valid point.
But at the same time, maybe ISSB needed, not like EUs, needed to more, take a harmonization with different regions. So that this important part is you have to continue to discuss with several different regions. So that somehow you are avoiding to define in detail of what is sustainability, and somehow continuing to discuss what is important for company, what is important for sustainability. That's somehow your how can I say, your way?
Yeah, it's definitely open to interpretation, right? So what impacts the sustainability of a company, right? So if a company is no longer in business because it hasn't managed certain issues well, right, that itself was unsustainable. But it's a fair point, and I think it's a very interesting conversation. And I don't know, to your point about the EU taxonomy, which has 500 pages, and sometimes overdoes it. How do we reconcile those?
Yeah,
that flexibility, right?
Yeah, there are two positive opinion and negative opinion. Some positive opinion is it's clear the definition, so that must be easier for company and investor side for explanation what is green. But another point is that if government decided what is green, there is no room that company challenging to something new, and also
right. And so we're definitely not aiming to establish a taxonomy for green or to replicate what's going on in the European Union and now the UK. I think it is really limiting this to the concept of sustainability related disclosure. And that again is kind of a conversation between you and your investors, really at the level of disclosure. What are investors thinking is related to the sustainability of your business. So for example, again, getting back to a beverage company, the issues that you face as a beer company are likely to be very different from the issues faced by a bank or a services company, which are also different from an oil and gas company. So, right. So they're not going to be the same. And I think that's why there's flexibility built in here.
Thank you very much. And go to the next question. But before that, please send us any question. We don't have so much question now, so that please don't hesitate. And also Japanese is okay. So go to the next question. From the Takara-san question. He had two questions. One of them is on industrial basis requirement. How the industry and defined, how industry defined. I have had many similar questions. And can a company select the most appropriate industry by itself? So,
excellent question. So in the early days of SASB, we set up what we call a sustainable industry classification system, or SICS. And that industry classification organizes companies and industries based on the use of resources and the sustainability related risks and opportunities that they share in an industry. So it's very much, it's very similar to GICS or GICS, but with some significant differences. So it's really kind of brought the industry classification system into the 21st century by doing away with industries like buggy whip manufacturers and some really outdated industries that really don't exist anymore, and also carved out new industries which had been previously embedded in others. So you'll see a renewables industry and alternative resources industry in the sustainable industry classification system, and in GICS and other industry classifications, renewables are lumped together with just energy, fossil fuels. And so if you want to encourage a transition to a lower carbon economy, it's nice to have renewables outside as their own thing. And they also have very different sustainability related risks and opportunities. So that was the architecture of how we started to take a look at then, all right, what issues are most likely to affect enterprise value or financial materiality at the industry level. So the sustainable industry classification system plays a major role there. Now, if you go onto the SASB website, which still exists, and you type in your ticker symbol, you'll come up with what we call a primary industry classification. But in this day and age, there are a lot of companies that operate in more than one industry. So don't let the primary industry classification designation be off-putting if you do business in other industries. We really think that companies know their own business well enough to say, well, I do some industry, I operate in, tech, I have exposure to risks and opportunities in, this information and IT services industry. And so you can kind of choose a la carte those industries that are most relevant to your business, especially if you're a conglomerate and you're doing business across 10 different industries. You would expect your investors would want to know your risks and opportunities across those different industries. So you can definitely choose those that are most relevant to you. So don't let the primary industry classification sort of be, some people see that as like, oh, that you don't understand my business. And it's meant to be a primary, sort of bucketing of where a company would fit. But you can also take a look at the whole array of industry standards and say, well, these are the ones that are most relevant to my business and what my investors are asking me about. So that's kind of a long-winded question to our answer to your question, but hopefully it's helpful. And then I don't know if we want to take the GRI question next, or if you want to do that later. There's a question about how we'll collaborate with GRI. So when let's see, I think it was right around the time the exposure drafts were published, we also published an announcement that we have an MOU with GRI, and it's a really interesting situation. So if you go back to that set of nested boxes graph, where financials and then ISSB, and then the outer box, which is where GRI sits, and the perforated borders between those different chambers of that system, if you will, is really to indicate that there are things that GRI sets standards for today that ISSB will need to set standards for tomorrow, and that we need to be able to horizon scan along with GRI and call things by the same names so that companies and investors can start communicating with the same language about things. But it also designates sort of like which lane each of us is in. So ISSB is in the enterprise value focused lane, if you will. We're focused on setting standards that are investor focused with a clear focus on enterprise value or financial materiality. And GRI is looking at those impact oriented things that a company is doing and measuring the impact of those things. But they're closely related. As we were talking about earlier, things can jump over that hurdle of financial materiality in a hurry. So ISSB will sit on the GRI advisory board, and a representative from GRI or GSSB will sit on the ISSB advisory board and start to talk about how we can horizon scan from ISSB and look for potentially emerging issues that we ought to be thinking about putting into the ISSB standard setting pipeline and get market feedback on. So it's, I think, a huge advancement in helping, sort of consolidate the myriad players on, this prior to this very dizzying landscape of disclosure and frameworks, and beginning to demonstrate how they actually can, coalesce and coexist and collaborate with one another.
Okay, thank you very much. So go to the next questions. So next question is Araki-san question. The way to make domestic standards closer towards the international standards in a term of the IFRS, both approach of the adoption and the convergence. Yes, that is a good question. That's a good question. So that maybe adoption directly or the convergence to the domestic standard close to the maybe his question is SASB standard, but maybe he wanted to ask you about the ISSB. I think.
Yeah, I'm just reading it and trying to process it, and I guess I've had a really long day. So as the way to make domestic standards closer towards international IFRS, both approach
adoption or
convergence are generally accepted. Is this also the case in terms of SASB standards?
I think
is the question asking about the internationalization of SASB standards? I'm sorry, I just don't understand.
I think he had maybe mistake about not SASB standard. I think IFRS, ISSB.
ISSB. So I'll answer it to the best of my ability, the way that I understand the question, but I'm not sure I'm fully understanding it. So I'll back up a little bit by saying the ISSB standards have many SASB standards inside them, so I can see why you would ask a question about SASB standards. So we have identified over the years that there are about just under 20% of the metrics in SASB standards, which are challenging to apply internationally. That's because they refer to either rules or laws specific to the United States, because there was no other alternative at the time the standards were set, or that was the feedback we got at the time about the best way of measuring that thing. And so we recognize that we have this problem with about 20% of the metrics. There's a standards internationalization advancement project that has been underway for a while now, and some of the product of that project is evident in the climate standards, which have been, some of the SASB metrics have been internationalized or made more applicable internationally. And the rest of those that remain problematic will become part of the ISSB work projects moving forward. So we recognize that, SASB standards were sort of incubated, if you will, in North America, but they are not meant to be a domestic standard for North America. And we are very much we're delighted that we're now going to be part of the IFRS, and that IFRS is very committed to making this truly applicable and, around the world. So I hope that answers the question, but I'm not sure I quite got.
I think that maybe he wanted to ask about comparing with the accounting standard. In case of accounting standard, in Asian regions, there are so many domestic accounting standards going to convergence to the IFRS. So, for example, the Malaysia is MSRS, and also that the Australia is AAS, IFRS, so AARS. So that is the domestic version, but fully adapting and convergence to the IFRS. So there are several ways to adapt the international.
Okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question.
So I think use the word of the convergence, so that I thought. But
okay. Yeah, so we're seeing the bubbling up of different domestic accounting standards boards in Australia, in Japan with the SSBJ, which are going to, I think, presumably the designated bodies that will determine whether or not ISSB standards are adopted in Japan, for example, or in Australia, as the case may be. So that's playing out in real time, right? So the UK also has, I can't remember what they're forming, but everybody has their own process by which they either adopt or endorse the uptake of the standards in their own market. And that's probably one of the slides that I skipped over that was in my original deck that talks about the different nodes of adoption
Yeah.
And it's really a kind of a complex mix of what happens jurisdiction by jurisdiction. IOSCO can recommend that member jurisdictions adopt the standards, but then it's still up to the jurisdictions to take action. And so we're hoping that market demand from investors will create the conditions that will enable regulatory action jurisdiction by jurisdiction. But it isn't overnight, that ISSB standards will be taken up in 140 jurisdictions just because IFRS accounting standards are taken up. It's going to play out kind of piecemeal around the world.
Thank you very much. So go to the next question. Next question is, you touched upon the definition of material information, but what about the definition of significant risk? Do you think that the clearly guidance on the point of the needed? Or do you think it is intentionally
I think I don't think it's intentionally vague, but I do think that there are many people who have a similar question, and because I've answered this question before, and my colleague who has helped me answer this question before is you can imagine our technical team gets very technical about things. So I'll tell you the answer as it's been given to me. So the use of significant is intended to clarify that we don't expect entities to report on every conceivable risk or opportunity. Entities will determine for themselves what is significant in the context of their strategic, operational, and compliance objectives and their risk appetite or tolerance. And the use of material is intended to denote the threshold for disclosure of information. So entities also make that determination for themselves based on what would be important for investors to know in assessing their enterprise value. So it's a little, again, getting back to the human mind wanting there to be a this or that kind of situation happening. It's a very nuanced distinction between significant. So significant is maybe one way of thinking about it is like the first level of sifting, like, okay, you don't have to report on all of these things. What's significant? And then of those significant things, what's material to your investors? Hopefully that helps.
The Japanese people have a problem about significant, materiality, important, and essential.
Right, because they're all very similar or the same word. So this has obvious problems, right? When even the translation in this case, I think makes it worse than makes it better, and it's something that we need to figure out how we overcome, because I'm getting this question a lot.
So thank you very much. So go to the next question. Next question from the Toyosaki-sans. So in terms of the materiality, what time frame should be aimed at to assess impact on the enterprise value for the reporting standards?
Right. I should have an answer to this, but I don't. I'm sorry. I don't. I think short, medium, and long term can mean different things in different industries, right? So again, this is an assessment that I think between a company and its investors would say, this is an obvious example, but a fast fashion industry player, right? The short term is very short for them. So I don't think there's a hard and fast answer to this question. I do think it is industry. I don't want to say dependent, but I think it's industry adjacent. Most definitely. Like, how do you think about that in your financial reporting? I think framing it from that perspective will be helpful. But for some sustainability issues, which do have a longer fuse, but can become relevant, it's not identical. So if I can, I want to come back to you on with a better answer for that when I'm not so tired, because it's getting to be like 9:30 here.
So if you give us the answer later, we will send this answer for the order.
I'm taking a picture of this right now.
But this one is also, we have been discussed so much about the financial statement so that how much we have to the estimate on the future impact, and also that when the climate change issues coming in, we normally is not so the estimated for the longer, so that that become a discussion. So that maybe this is very important because now the sustainability reporting and financial statement is stay together. So that maybe this is a good question.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's also going to evolve, right? As our understanding of these impacts becomes more better understood.
So let's go to the next ones. Is from the Matsumura-san question on sustainability-related disclosure requirements. Would you mind to talk about the verifications? Verification, maybe assurance or something like that. Will third-party verification becomes a standard requirement? The investors are asset managers demanding this in the different jurisdictions.
Right. So another great question. And I think that the more we have the elevation of sustainability information to the same level of financial information, assurance and auditability is absolutely necessary. So it's not mandated right now, but I can tell you that the ISSB is looking to develop the standards through which these disclosures can be assured and audited. And there's a real patchwork of how this happens currently with sustainability reporting, and it varies dramatically market by market. There's actually a very high level of assurance by the auditing profession of sustainability information in Asia. In the US, it's mostly by consultants and other parties and less so by the accounting profession. So it's not the same market by market, and I don't know how to account for the differences, but I was recently on a panel with someone from IFAC who had very interesting data about how this plays out around the world. But I think as we see this sort of, the connectivity between the financial information and the sustainability information, obviously, you're going to want to validate that information has the same level of controls, internal controls, the rigor around the process, and has been assured. So I think the short answer to that is watch this space. I think it's not required right now, but it's certainly coming.
So at this moment, this exposure draft not require the mandatory require for assurance or the verification on this report.
Yeah, and if you think that it should be required, then now is the time to comment. But there's definitely a desire for the elevation of the quality of the information.
Yeah, thank you very much. So go to the next questions. How does the company define the significance? Again, similar questions. So maybe people have so much interest in this part.
I think it's a judgment call. I mean, again, getting back to sort of the distinction that we did make, between significant and material. It is really again, you may say, well, that's not significant to me, and therefore it won't be material because it's not even in the mix of things that I'm considering to report on. And you still may get a question from an investor about a topic, right? So I think there's no checklist of significant things, right? You have to look at your business. You have to look at the risks and opportunities that you face as an enterprise, and then say, right, some of these seem more important than others. Some are more significant than others. Some are insignificant. I mean, language is, people use different terminology for very, very important reasons. So in this case, that's so specific to disclosure, I think it's an excellent question. There's no hard and fast answer to it, unfortunately. It's really a judgment call. And I think,
I stopped reading it, and so that the question is continued to the management company should understand what is significant for investors in terms of the stock price. What do you think about that?
I think it's not only related to the stock price, right? I think it's, we have a phrase in the US that the market is not the economy. And I think there's a corollary there that enterprise value isn't always the stock price, especially in volatile times. And again, that kind of relates to this question about the short, the medium, and the long term. You can have a stock that's got great performance today that tomorrow runs into a reputational risk problem and then falls off a cliff. So it's the sort of that interconnectedness of how a company is managing these issues that creates this long-term value creation story. So it is what an investor would want to know. So there are many kinds of investors, right? Investors are not monolithic. So there are some day traders, are they investors? They have a very different motive than an index fund manager that can't sell your stock, that wants every company to be doing well on these things because the whole index is their portfolio. So again, know who your investors are, would be my answer to that question, and what they're asking you, right? So if they're engaging with you, you already know what some of their concerns are. And then it is about that dialogue between management, the board, what are you hearing? What are, when you scan the horizon on the market, what do you think are potentially significant risks or opportunities related to your enterprise value? And that can play out in days, that can play out over decades.
Yeah, of course, it's not about day trader, about the word of the investor that we currently mentioned in this the exposure draft, but at the same time, maybe stock price is somehow reaction from investors. So if stock price will reflect in something, maybe company side need to consider about what's happened, what is investors' concern more seriously. So that is one of the dialogue we believe like this.
Yeah, I think it's also related to your cost of capital. I think that's an indicator that is also quite related to what, if there's lack of transparency, that is in some investors' minds implies higher risk, because they don't have an understanding of how you're managing these things. And so you may have a higher cost of capital over time. So it's not only about the stock price.
Okay, so now we don't have any more questions. So that can I ask you two questions related to the previous Tara-san's questions? So you said that the primary business. So is that the meaning about the size of the sales or size of the revenue from one of the segments? Because company normally have several different business segments. So what are the primary business? It's the largest volume of the sales, or
so that's a good question in terms of how we go about identifying the primary industry classification. Is that your question? It's more related to the sustainability risks and opportunities in a given set of businesses, right? Your determination of which industry standards to use, though, may be very related to the revenue related to those lines of business. There's the industry classification, the broader, like where did things fall into different buckets when we made those industry classifications, and then you put your ticker in and you get the answer, and you may not agree with that because you are doing business across a variety of industries. So I would say that, again, what would your investors want to know? So here's an interesting sort of, flipping that idea on its head. Let's say I'm an oil exploration and production company that is diversifying, and I am making investments in renewable energy production. And that might be a small fraction of my total revenues, but it might be a huge potential growth opportunity for me and a way of cleaning up my emissions, right? Because if I can transition away, Ørsted is a great example of this, right? So they went from one thing to a completely other thing, which is now their whole line of work. So, ask yourself, what story am I trying to tell? If I'm wanting to communicate, I am diversifying, you would not necessarily only look at the revenue, you'd also be wanting to talk about the investments that you're making, the capital allocation decisions you're making to clean up or change the company. I shouldn't say clean.
Yeah, we have only 1 minute, but very important, looks like a very important questions coming in. So that let's take this question and last question as last question. Can I ask you to answer this one? Industrial classification may be very depending on local markets, and the industry classification in SASB may not fit. Maybe the person who sent us other questions. So what they can do in that case?
Can you give me an example of a local market condition that creates this distinction? Because I haven't seen one yet, and I would love to.
Okay, but in case that maybe new business is appeared and then they can't find any industry, what they can do under this? Can they create new ones or something?
There are a couple of things. So if a company feels that they're just completely mismatched by industry, like in the industry classification system, you can say, I think my primary industry is really this, and we can change that. And you can also, if you're waiting for that to happen, say, well, I'm reporting to these standards because they're more relevant to my business. So you can make that choice, and that's fine. And then if there is the birth of a new industry, like, I don't know, I saw something today that I thought was hilarious, like a company that makes protein from air. I don't know. Okay. That's like a tech food ag, like combo. I don't know where that would fit in our industry classification. So you could call us or reach out, but there will be new industries that develop, and so the industry classification system will have to evolve over time.
Maybe this one is depend on the expectation, how much details the investor needs, so that it still there looks like similar the industry classification, but still some investor not satisfied. So that maybe this one is continuing, we should discuss about, and then that maybe seeking something what is a good solution for about.
Yeah, and there may be, required updates to the sustainable industry classification system, over time. So that's, again, where feedback is really welcome and necessary, because if it's not fit for purpose, it needs to be changed.
So thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is coming. So thank you very much. It's 1 hour and a half to explaining. It's been a lot of things. Thank you very much, Katie. Please send her to the big hand to Katie.